All right, so we are good to go. Welcome everyone. I am Ashley Sergiotis, the Digital Scholarship Librarian at East Tennessee State University and one of the co-conveners of the Digital Collections Discussion Group as part of ACRL's Digital Scholarship section. My co-convener is here today, Nashiela Macano. And we are excited that you all could join us today for the last part of our discussion group's Lightning Talk series on digital collections in teaching and research. So in the spirit of building a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive environment in the DSS community, I wanted to take a moment to discuss the Digital Scholarship Section's community agreement. As a community, we expect that all DSS meetings will start with this agreement, so it becomes a standard practice. I'm now going to read the beginning part of this agreement. The DSS community agrees to frame interactions in DSS spaces and meetings with the following guidelines in mind. We recognize that we will all make mistakes and may unintentionally harm individuals or groups as we engage as a community, but we agree to take responsibility for the results of our words and actions. So today we have a great lineup of 3 presentations. During the presentations, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. Nashieli will be there to monitor the chat and make sure that all questions are addressed as long as time allows. And please choose all panelists and attendees in the chat when asking the questions. So let's start our presentations. First up is Theresa Hessey, talking about out of the archives and into the classroom. I will stop sharing.
Good afternoon. Hopefully you all can see my screen. My name is Theresa Hessey. I'm a digital collections librarian at the University of Delaware. And I am here to talk about a class that we collaborated with and some of the projects that we completed with that class. In the fall of 2018, the library was approached by Dr. Laura Helton of our English and History departments about a collaboration between Special Collections and our Digital Collections and Preservation department for a class that she created as a seminar, a senior capstone called Into the Archives. And what she proposed was that her class be able to use a manuscript collection that we had, the Langston Hughes Ephemera collection. And this class included 3 major components. She wanted her students to create metadata, item level metadata for the collection. The students would then complete data visualizations using StoryMaps.js, and they would also create a physical pop-up exhibit using the collection and other special collections materials. So to begin this process, the Digital Collections and Preservation Department digitized the collection. The collection had been described by our Manuscripts and Archives department at the folder level, so students would be responsible for creating item level metadata records for approximately 50 items. The collection was then uploaded to our DSpace institutional repository, which we have locally branded as UDSpace. I conducted 2 metadata discussion sessions with the class. We really talked about how metadata is created. The students helped to determine the fields to be included, which sometimes were not the same as what our professional standards are. We created standards that the students wanted to use for this particular collection. And each student was assigned 2 to 4 items to create metadata records for in that digital collection. Some of the decision-making process was more about how this metadata would be used than how the metadata in the collection would be presented. So students, because they knew that they would be creating digital data visualizations using this metadata, were interested in including a lot more information in an Excel spreadsheet than we ordinarily would present with a digital collection. So some of the questions involved were what level of detail to provide. What we generally do is provide metadata based on how that collection has been processed, and students for this instance were interested in providing much more information. So they included things such as who the organization was that sponsored some of these talks, what venues were included, what the addresses were, whether there were advertisements included in these programs. We had many discussions about how we would format dates, names, locations, because the students wanted to be able to sort the spreadsheet using certain fields. We definitely separated them out a lot more than we would for one of our own digital collections. And then once all the records were put together in a single spreadsheet, we again had to look for consistency and spelling across the collection. The students used the metadata to look for themes across the collection that they could document in the story map. And in groups, students selected topics to pursue. Some of these topics included Langston Hughes's appearances at various churches. So students were able to tie in not only the ephemera that was in the collection, but also some of his travels as they were reported in local newspapers and things of that sort. Another student group chose to track how particular performances occurred throughout the country. This particular one chose a Langston Hughes play called Simply Heavenly and used the playbills that were in the collection to track various performances of this, as well as their reviews in local papers. Some of the challenges that we had with this collection were the students chose to establish some standards for this class that don't adhere to our professional standards. For that reason, making this metadata usable for our digital collection would actually require some extensive work to make them adhere to both the professional standards and some of the standards that we have established at the local level. And an additional challenge was reconciling metadata that had been created by 16 different students and getting kind of their take on the metadata. Some of the outcomes for the students were they definitely walked away with a better understanding of metadata and the amount of work that goes into it and how and why certain choices are made with the decisions that we make. One of the other things was this experience allowed them to interact with the materials in a very unique way that they would not ordinarily get, because they were allowed to have hands-on interactions with the material as well as digital copies and creating a pop-up exhibit. This was something that was definitely a unique experience. In fact, last year we attempted to do a similar version of this class, but because of COVID, of course, it was entirely online, and the students, I feel, definitely missed out on the opportunity to do the hands-on interaction with the material. So thank you. I'm including links to both the finding aid and to the digital collections. And if there are any questions, I would be happy to.
Thank you so much, Theresa, for the wonderful presentation. I so far don't see anything typed in the queue, so we can go ahead and continue with Selena and Deborah's presentation. Thank you again, Theresa.
Thank you, Michelle. Just get it rolled up. Thank you. Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to our presentation today, Discovery After Digitization, Encouraging Research Through Engagement. My name is Selena Bryant, and my title is Teaching and Learning Librarian. And the other speaker today is Deborah Cooper, Digital and Special Collections Librarian. We both work at Van Library, which supports the colleges of Agriculture and Life Sciences, as well as Human Ecology at Cornell University. In late 2019, Deborah and I began collaborating and discussing how we could bring to light the little known resources in our special collections that we thought deserved greater recognition and awareness. These conversations led us to one of our relatively unknown rare newspapers, The Modern Farmer. We quickly realized what a valuable primary resource we had sitting in our vault, and then embarked upon this work. But before we get to what The Modern Farmer is, we'll just talk a bit about more how we decided to do research on that specific collection. So despite the physical holding residing at the library for many decades, it wasn't until a patron's research visit that the historical significance of the resource was brought to our attention. In October 2017, a patron named Thane Scott was coming to Cornell to present at a meeting. He requested access to The Modern Farmer, and he shared with us that copies of this publication were exceptionally hard to find, and explained his personal connection to the materials. James P. Davis, the publisher, was also Scott's great-grandfather. As a result of Mr. Scott's visit, we became aware that Mann Library holds the only known surviving full-run print copies of this primary resource. Soon after, we performed due diligence to establish there were no claims on copyright, and with the help of an internal grant, the library proceeded to digitize the publication to make it more widely available and accessible. So what is The Modern Farmer? The Modern Farmer was one of the only publications in the Depression-era United States that was aimed at African-American farmers. It was established by the National Federation of Colored Farmers, which we will refer to as NFCF during this presentation. And it was published monthly in Chicago, Illinois, and Nashville, Tennessee between 1929 and 1949. The NFCF was founded in Chicago in 1922 by a group of African-American attorneys and an engineer. Their purpose was to build the capacity of America's Black farmers and ensure they could be profitable and self-reliant. They operated by forming local chapters of buying and selling distribution cooperatives, which allowed members to have a larger share of sales. The organization brokered steady market access to urban industrial cities in the North's wholesale markets, particularly Chicago. Membership initially consisted of African-American farmers in the Midwest, and it expanded across the South when they began publishing The Modern Farmer. Throughout the newspaper, there is a strong editorial case for the power of organizing and collective strategizing. This goal was a key part of the NFCF's manifesto, which was printed in every edition. In the 1930s, the majority of African Americans still lived in the South, and 2/3 worked in agriculture in some way. One major event that affected this population included the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, which destroyed large amounts of farmland owned on or worked on by Black agricultural workers. This event accelerated the first Great Migration, which saw millions of African Americans relocate to northern urban industrial cities from rural areas in the South. Other significant and relevant events during this time were the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, as well as Jim Crow segregation and constant racial violence. Though this was a tumultuous time, the NFCF thrived because by joining the organization, farmers had more power locally and had a national voice. And through The Modern Farmer, members could learn of specific opportunities and news that would affect them. The Modern Farmer was published for African-American farmers, so agricultural topics are naturally fully covered in every issue. But within its pages, there are also many sociological insights. This is a highly interdisciplinary primary source at the intersection of history, political science, and agriculture. Topics regularly covered were political organizing, agricultural best practices, and opportunities for financial help. Later editions also included a women's section. So we chose to focus on The Modern Farmer as a case study of collection outreach because of the aforementioned historical significance. The print version of this publication had very low usage, and even after digitization in 2017, the views were also very low. We both felt very strongly that The Modern Farmer deserved to be a regularly used primary source, integrated into multiple subject areas. We discussed the widely used approach of curriculum mapping, whereby librarians look at course offerings and suggest specific resources to the instructors of those classes. However, we wanted an approach that would most influence discovery and access, and that would potentially reach the broadest population of people, regardless of their identity as researchers, students, or instructors. So with that in mind, we devised a multi-pronged outreach strategy using digital tools. We selected Wikipedia as one of the tools for outreach for several reasons. It is one of the most visited websites in the world, and African-American history is underrepresented on the site. Wikipedia provides the opportunity to promote this material to a global audience, allowing for serendipitous discovery. The platform actively engages with its users and allows anyone to add information to the page, contributing their knowledge. So we began by creating a page for The Modern Farmer as a jumping off point. Wikipedia has a defined multi-step process to create a new page. Contributors have to learn the guidelines and policies of the site, and there are multiple checks in place before a page can be made fully visible to the public.
We decided to host a Wikipedia-related event during Black History Month as a bridge to let people know about the modern farmer and to encourage and show attendees how to add to Wikipedia. A Black in STEM Wikipedia editathon was held on February 25th of this year. The event was cross-promoted by the library's communications department and by contacting relevant student groups. The library's promotion was pushed out via the wider Cornell communications channels, including heavy promotion on social media. The event was co-sponsored by a student group, the Cornell chapter of MANAS, Minorities in Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Related Sciences. Event information for the Wikipedia editathon was placed on the newly created Modern Farmer LibGuide, which served to drive traffic to the guide while informing attendees about the event. As I just alluded to, one of the other tools that we decided to produce was an online research guide about the modern farmer, commonly known as a LibGuide. Some specific advantages of this platform are that it's flexible and allows for ongoing additions and revisions. We carried out extensive research into relevant subjects, themes, and events represented in the pages of the modern farmer in order to place it in its historical context. We included a tab listing the results of this research and several important background references. This helps provide suggestions for lesson planning and emphasizes the interdisciplinary nature of the resource. The LibGuide lends context to the modern farmer and gives faculty a well-rounded idea of the ways it can be incorporated into their class. The LibGuide was published on December 2nd, 2020. Between then and early March, it had gained just over 300 views. This cross-promotion with the Wikipedia editathon event was helpful. As you can see in the graph, the page views spiked, first when we announced the event and then on the day of the event itself. The content continues to evolve as we discover new information, and we'll continue to use it as a tool to promote the resource and begin conversations with faculty. The Modern Farmer Wikipedia page was made fully visible to the public in December. There have been 315 page views as of mid-May. The page has been edited by members of the public, and engagement with the page can only increase with time. We conducted additional research about the modern farmer to exceed Wikipedia standards of corroboration and citation. Since publication of this page was a success, we created an additional page for the NFCF. The Wikipedia Black in STEM Editathon event helped increase awareness and visitors to the Wikipedia page on that day. In preparing for the event, we discovered a lack of existing pages overall that we could find on Black agricultural history, which confirmed for us the importance of editing the Modern Farmer page to this platform. Sorry, the importance of adding the Modern Farmer page to this platform. The editathon was managed by the Wikimedia Outreach Dashboard, which tracks edits and allows for easy organization and access to the relevant information that attendees need. 31 people registered for the event and 15 people participated live in the 2-hour sprint. Attendees included undergraduates, graduates, librarians, faculty, researchers, and community members, so a diverse group of people were made aware of this archival collection. Editing was open for a week beyond the event to allow the opportunity to make more edits. You can see the final editing numbers in the slide. These activities have provided a solid foundation for outreach and expanded the overall historical record. In reflecting on this work and strategy, we can identify some unforeseen but inevitable challenges along the way, as well as important successes. All of this promotion took place during the pandemic, which undoubtedly impacted the work. For example, we can only speculate that the remote environment had a dampening effect on the capacity of faculty to directly engage with us. The research required to promote this material was time-intensive, but familiarized us with the time period and the work. The creation of tools to promote the resource was a successful strategy in and of itself. Both the LibGuide and Wikipedia pages contributed to the overall outreach plan. One particular tool was not more effective than another, rather they worked in tandem to achieve the goal. The impact of the creation of public-facing digital tools is hard to measure immediately, but this is a permanent and highly visible way to promote the Modern Farmer collection. Future plans include reaching out to faculty directly over this summer so that they may possibly incorporate the Modern Farmer into fall instruction. We hope to collaborate with other Cornell curators for an exhibit. Having the digital tools we've already created available when communicating the significance of the resource will pave the way for these important conversations. This is Man Library's first prominent collection of African American agricultural history and has opened doors to many special collection talks in Black history and agriculture, making connections to new audiences. Finally, if you're interested in reading The Modern Farmer, it's freely accessible at the link in the slide, as well as in the Internet Archive. Thanks for listening to our presentation today. And here's our references.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Selena and Deborah, for the presentation. Very diverse group of users, and kind of cool to see that they can see themselves not just as consumers of information, but also producers of content. So that's really nice. Thank you. All right, we are ready to go with David. David, take it away. I don't see any questions so far in the queue, so we can continue.
Good afternoon. My name is David Shedden, and I am the Special Collections Librarian at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg campus, Nelson Pointer Memorial Library. And today I wanted to talk about how we have created a research guide to help preserve and share our weekly Challenger digital African American newspaper archive. The weekly Challenger has documented the history of St. Petersburg's African American community since the newspaper was established by Cleveland Johnson back in 1967. Our library is honored to partner with the Weekly Challenger to preserve, promote, and share digital access to the newspaper's archives. The digital archive is a primary and secondary source for researchers of history, journalism, anthropology, and other disciplines trying to learn about St. Petersburg's African American community. The Johnson family's Weekly Challenger newspaper states the following front page motto, quote, "Keeping you connected to your community," unquote. One of our hopes at the library is to help preserve the history of those community conversations by providing access to the newspaper stories. In 2018, the library successfully finished the scanning phase of the Weekly Challenger archive project. And in 2019, we began focusing on using the collection's materials as a research and teaching resource. We found that many students and researchers didn't know enough about the newspaper and local history to search the Weekly Challenger digital archive, which you currently see on the screen. To meet that need, a detailed research guide titled The Weekly Challenger African American Digital Newspaper Archive and Research Guide has been created as a way to introduce various topics and various historic subjects. The guide introduces researchers to the newspaper, the archive, and local African American history with a number of different sections, including an index, a bibliography, and a historical chronology based around newspaper stories. Other sections include links to local St. Petersburg, Tampa, and Florida community resources that relate to Weekly Challenger article topics. As an example, during the last year, we have added links to Black Lives Matter related stories. This photograph, for instance, comes from a story written in June of 2020. When I'm showing the guide to students and researchers, I sometimes use Google Earth as a way to connect newspaper stories to specific locations. This view shows where the current Tampa Bay Rays baseball stadium, which is called Tropicana Field, is located. The property is also the former home to a historic African American neighborhood. Here we see an excerpt from a 2011 story at the location described in the article. Let me read just a few sentences. Quote, Jock Edwards was born January 19th, 1937 at 1514 4th Avenue South, right where Tropicana Field now sits. The family lived there until he was in junior high school, then moved to a bigger house right next door at 1516. There he lived until he graduated from Gibbs High School. Booker Creek, which he and his friends learned to swim, ran through the area. And here we see a story and an old 1950s advertisement from the African American section of another newspaper called the Tampa Bay Times. And the story is about how Ray Charles used to perform at a local music venue called the Manhattan Casino. Ray Charles even wrote a song about the city called St. Petersburg, Florida Blues. And when I have time, I'd like to link to the audio of Ray Charles actually performing that song. The research guide also has a story map that links articles to locations featured in a local walking tour of a historic African American sites. I also wanted to share one of my favorite moments about the project. The Weekly Challenger published a front page story about our research guide. Their story introduced our archive to the Weekly Challenger readers. In addition, the story was written by a University of South Florida journalism student. It was a wonderful example of how our library's partnership with the newspaper helps the community, students, and future researchers. Finally, I wanted to say that we are excited about the future of this digital archive. No matter what print or digital format the newspaper of the future comes in, Weekly Challenger stories will continue to add to important community conversations. And we look forward to using our Weekly Challenger research guide to help preserve and share those stories for the community and future students and researchers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. It's really nice to see that we have been engaging the community. Now more and more community engagement is key, and projects like this really allow the community to get engaged and to sustain that type of engagement. So thank you. All right, we are going to go to our Q&A session now, and we have a previous question typed. This one is for Theresa. I'll read it now. Curious what your workflow QC, I would think that's quality control, look like when you reconciled and structured the student metadata. I would love to see an example of that, if you have one, or if you could explain what it looked like in a concrete way. That would help. We're doing something very similar, and so far I've just gone through each record one by one. Haha. So Theresa, would you like to address it? Thank you for your question.
Sure. What we did for this, well, first off, this is not the first class that I've worked with, so I did learn some lessons the first go round. So what we did for this particular class is we established a Google Doc, a spreadsheet that students, and actually let me go ahead and share my screen very quickly, that students could enter their information in. So they could not only see what they were creating, but also how other students had structured their metadata. And then this was created, and the professor and I both gave feedback. So there are areas where we could give feedback to the students. And then we actually discussed it in the next class period. So basically what we did is we made the students reconcile their own metadata. The first time that I worked with a class, it was very much less structured, and having no firmly established deadlines led to multiple emails where student A decided to make this change, please update the metadata. Student B made these changes, update the metadata. So what I've learned is it makes a lot more sense and is much less time consuming on my end to have the students create their own, or correct their own metadata. And that way, when you have that conversation at that group level, they can see how it all works together, and everyone's metadata does need to look the same in many respects and be consistent. And so I find that just makes the process a little easier. What we have decided to do with this particular set of metadata is not to make it publicly available as part of our digital collection, largely because the collection was processed at the folder level. And so therefore it would mean a lot of work, both with our manuscripts and archives department and with digital collections, in order to make this metadata accessible. We would essentially have to reprocess the entire collection. And so it's just not feasible at this point. But it is very helpful to have established guidelines and deadlines, and then give the instructor or the metadata librarian time to look at that metadata and provide feedback before their actual assignment deadline. So hopefully that is helpful. If you have other questions, do please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to share my experiences, good and bad.
Thank you, Theresa. Yes, thank you. That is very helpful. It's kind of neat to see how students can get to curate materials, and I think metadata is key. And if they can fall in love with the metadata, that's just the best way for them to engage with that object and to really appreciate it. So let's see if we have any other questions here.
I had a follow-up question related to that, Theresa, because I manage a lot of student workers and they do metadata for digital collections. And so you get to kind of learn what are common mistakes that they make. And I was just wondering if there was a trend of, at least when the first time you did it, where you're like, oh, I'm gonna have to explain how to do that in more detail because everyone's doing it different ways.
Yes, and the first one that we came across was a field that we always include is country. And, we were establishing that we thought it should be United States. The students, there was some heated debate for a long time about what they wanted to include and how they wanted it to be formatted. And ultimately, a vote was taken and they decided USA because it required less typing on their part, which, whatever. But again, it does not follow the professional standard. And because we knew that this metadata was being created largely for them to create a story map out of it rather than our, what we would actually put up. We kind of threw some professional standards out the window for them. They did not want to fully write out states. They wanted to use the abbreviations. So things like that, it's very interesting. And I have worked with other people who we do have instances where students create metadata for our public collections. And it is very, very important that we have printed out guidelines of, what our formatting looks like, what our style is, what is acceptable, what is not, and providing pretty much immediate feedback so that they don't continue making the same error with metadata. But yes, it's been a very interesting process to see. It actually helps me to look at my work differently, to see it from students' perspectives. One of the classes that I worked with this semester questioned why we use the term creator unknown rather than creator unidentified. And so that has actually brought up a huge question in our library about whether we are going to change our standard. So, working with students, while it is time consuming, I do think that it really enriches how they learn and the things that they know about our collections and how data is stored and used.
Yeah, that touched on the last question I had for you, because I was curious if your practices changed doing this project, because a lot of times we get stuck in like, this is what's professional, this is what we've been taught to do, and sometimes we don't think of it from a user standpoint or someone who's unfamiliar with digital collections who may actually be using the collections more than ourselves. So I thought that's interesting.
Yes, and it's one of the things that I try to tell students is that they, like for instance, with this class, they knew more about Langston Hughes and his material and his movements across the country than I ever could. And so, please use that expertise to describe this material in a way that I would never, I simply, you can't take the time to do that for every collection. And so, I'm perfectly happy to have students create metadata that is a lot more in-depth than what we have the time and opportunity to do. And we do have collections where that has happened, and they have very in-depth descriptions of what a user can see, and they also have they have different ideas about what types of metadata and what types of information users find helpful. And so it's been really fascinating to kind of see it from a different perspective.
All right, thank you for that. I was wondering if David, if you can share that audio piece that you mentioned during your presentation. We would love to hear some of that.
Oh, okay. If you can come back to me, let me go find it, and then I'll come back. Okay, thank you.
Well, while you do that, I'll go ahead and ask Theresa a follow-up question. It seems like, and this could be for all presenters, that there are many different learning curves to be reduced here, especially students. You have the subject content for the class, and you have the technologies to use, like story maps and the metadata. Did you and the professor find a way to scaffold some of the skill building, or do you just went simultaneously building all those different set of skills?
In my experience, we have been able to scaffold some of the learning. Some of the faculty that I have worked with actually have archival backgrounds, so that has been very, very helpful. So they have an understanding of metadata and what digital collections look like and how archives are organized. So that has been very helpful, and it helps in that they can assist students throughout the class rather than just when we are in the classroom with them. But yes, we've been very lucky in that we are able to, like, for instance, we picked Story Maps JS because there was a very low bar of entry. And so it literally took probably an hour of class time, and the students had it. Like, these students are very technologically on the ball. So, that sort of thing has not been an issue. I don't know if others have the same experience or different, but I'd be interested in hearing that.
Cool. Yeah, I wonder, Selena and Deborah, since you have a diverse group of users, I'm sure everyone comes in with different set of working definitions. How did you find that common language, not to work together towards the same initiative?
Do you mean how did Selena and I come to work together? Okay.
With the different, types of
Yeah.
users. Mm-hmm.
We found a lot of common overlap, and I'm more on the collection side, but teaching and outreach are an integral part of that. I'll let Selena speak for her side of things.
I'll agree, and I'll say in terms of when we did bring users in for the Wikipedia editathon, the nice thing is that it was voluntary, so we got people who were interested in learning how to use Wikipedia. And in editathons, you spend the first hour, you separate people who know how to use it and who don't, and then that first hour is teaching them how to use Wikipedia. So with the interest, it's a little easier, I think, to sort of teach people how to use a new sort of software or platform. And then another great thing is after that first hour, everyone's together, and then we all help each other figure out like how to best do this or that, especially if it's something technology related. So that was kind of how we got around, I guess, that part when it came to users.
Neat. Okay, before we go to the audio, I'd like to pose another question on behalf of an audience member. Another question, same person. Do any of you help students add subject heading metadata? We have a Library of Congress subject headings as a field, and explaining how to find that is complicated. They are also nervous in picking one. I've considered leaving it out, but we have developed a word bank to help them get started. Wonder if anyone else has had experience talking to students about subject heading metadata. Thank you for your question.
Yes, that is something that we do include with other collections that we have worked with classes with. And generally it is, yes, it is kind of confusing for a lot of students. But I think, we have to because that is such a part of searching, not just library digital collections, but library collections in general, we do have to include that information. And we do something similar to what you do in that we create kind of a word bank to get them started. But we do have a lot of discussions about the level of detail that you get into with subject headings, and whether it's easier to stick to the broader subject headings and include a few more, or, you know, so it can be a very tricky conversation to have. But I do feel that it is necessary for students to understand kind of how that works and how library catalogs work and why it looks the way it does to them. You know, I think one of the most difficult things that I've noticed lately is kind of a need to teach them how to understand what words to use when they're looking in LCSH, that it may not be the same words that you would throw into a Google search. So for instance, I've been dealing with African-American photographs, and it's like, do you look for African-American? Do you look for Black? What subject terminology do you look for? So that the subject headings is actually a much longer conversation to have with students than I think some of the other, more clearly, here's the date, here's the, I think that can be a much broader conversation that needs to be had in my experience.
Absolutely. I think you've got to have that balance between using, learning to use controlled vocabularies, but also think about the audience and how to differentiate the user. How would someone access or inquire about that record from other perspectives, or language use. So, okay, we can go ahead and let David share the audio piece.
Okay, we'll see if this works here. Yeah, whoops, sorry about that. Yeah, as I said earlier, Ray Charles in the late 1940s and early 1950s performed at a local music venue called the Manhattan Casino, which actually still exists. What I'm going to try to do here now is actually just try to play the clip, and I'm not sure if you'll be able to hear it. But what I say to the students is try to imagine it's, let's say, I think this ad, if I remember, yes, 1957. I say try to imagine it's 1957, and you're visiting the African-American music venue, the Manhattan Casino, and you're listening to a relatively young Ray Charles performing the song, which was called St. Pete, Florida Blues. And I'll just play a few seconds of it. So that gives you a little bit of an idea. And I think it's also an example of history is music, it's the visuals, it's the newspapers, it's the photographs, it's all of these things together. And I oftentimes find with the students that when they hear the music, it makes a connection that some of these other things don't. So when we found out that he'd actually written a song about St. Petersburg, we realized it was going to be a great way to share some history. So.
Now, this is great. I think another aspect that has been really important within our context now, this compounded crisis that we're experiencing, is accessibility, and to find different ways of, again, engaging the user through music or through visual or through textual information. And with your project in particular, this aspect of intergenerational justice, I think would be interesting to see how different generations within that community can connect through a project like this. So thank you for sharing the audio. Any other questions?
I
or comment?
had one for David. Do you do any sort of assignments with the collection with the students? Or is it more showing them the collections?
Well, it's primarily a resource. We actually have a class. We have a journalism class called the Neighborhood News Bureau. It's an actual bureau in the African American community where the students actually, their primary focus is to tell the story of the African American community. So my primary role is to introduce them to the stories and to the history. However, I oftentimes will throw out ideas because, as I said at the very beginning, some of these students just don't know anything about their own history, their community's history. So if you go to the research guide on the front page, you'll notice there's an index. And most of those index subjects actually come from conversations that I've had with students trying to find topics that they might write about. So the Manhattan Casino oftentimes comes up because students are interested in music, but you'll find education, yeah, food. You'll find all sorts of topics. Some are very specific about inspirational figures from our community. But when you look at the index, in a way, the index is a story of my interaction with the students because it's the topics that come out of it. So I learn from the students, and oftentimes, after our conversations, oh, a new index term. So I'll add it on there because I know there'll be somebody else coming along. And what I've really been excited about is that it has grown over time and that people from the community, totally separate from the university, are using it as a resource. So it's part of our, as I said earlier, our ongoing partnership with the newspaper to connect with students and the wider community. So the index is a great, and one of my favorite parts of the research guide.
How has the community been using it? Do you know?
Well, one project I'm actually working with right now, I don't know if you remember that picture of Tropicana Field where the baseball stadium is. It used to be an African-American community called the Gas Plant neighborhood, or it had other names such as Sugar Hill. And basically that African-American community had an interstate go right through it, like many communities around the country, and essentially split the neighborhood. And then when the baseball stadium was built, the neighborhood was moved to another part. So essentially it was done away with. And part of that was a cemetery. And actually our research guide is helping with stories about the cemetery. So right now, as we speak, actually this week is a front page story in the Weekly Challenger about our the project that I'm working with some other faculty members and some members from the community, trying to learn more about this. There's actually 3 African-American cemeteries, which were basically where the parking lot is for the baseball stadium. So, and I know this is happening around the country, and trying to use the past to understand what these, how the community interrelated with the cemeteries. So, so that's a very specific and current example that we're doing. And sadly, it's a story that's being repeated across the country.
Well, it has been a way to reckon, with our complex past, and yeah, like you said, David, it's happening in all areas in the country. I know Clemson University is now going through that process. It's great for the new generation to know that there were others before them, and it's great to honor them. I think I had another question. Hold on. I actually forgot the question. Well, actually, yes. You talked about some interesting aspects. I'm gonna pose this question to everyone. Has there been a surprising finding, or story, or anything that you were not expecting to discover through these projects? Nothing surprising. How about anything that you would redo if you were to do it again? Some things that you would rethink and do differently?
Well, I know in my case, it's not so much redoing, but it's sort of realizing that, the process that we have, the first thing we did was to find as many old newspapers as we could. And there weren't many, I'm sorry to say. So we scanned those. And now our relationship with the newspaper is such they send us PDF files of each week's newspaper or every other week's newspaper, because it's being printed bi-weekly right now. And it's slowly growing and growing. And I'm just finding that the real value of this project will be in the years to come, because sadly, newspapers in general haven't been preserved, but African-American newspapers specifically have not been preserved. And I just believe deeply that newspapers are one of the best ways of preserving and sharing history. I like to say, or to paraphrase what someone else said, which is that newspapers are the first rough draft of history. The first draft is not perfect, but oftentimes it's all we have, and it's a great way to reconstruct the community. So I feel that my role is to create something so that when I'm gone, other people will be able to build on it. So I think as archivists, we are part of a continuum, and we do the best we can, and then we sort of pass it on to the next generation. And I'm just honored, as I said in my presentation, to be part of a partnership with a local newspaper that also believes deeply in preserving and sharing its own history.
Great, thank you. That legacy of just legacy is important, and that is so exciting that we can be part of that type of legacy. Anyone else?
I'll echo some of what David said, where it was difficult during this process when we were looking back to try to find other African-American agricultural history things, specifically how little was documented, and knowing that there is a lot of history around it, but there's very little that exists. And when we wanted to do a Wikipedia edit-a-thon event, we specifically, as we mentioned, wanted to do one around African-American history. And there's so little in Wikipedia about that we ended up broadening it. Because it's hard to get people who have not edited Wikipedia to sort of ask them to write new pages. So it wasn't necessarily surprising, but it was a bit sad during the process. So,
and I'll just add that maybe not surprising to some of us, but the fact that we own the only known print run, and we digitized it, but it still wasn't finding its users. So I think just the whole impetus for this was the surprise that people just didn't know about it, even though it's a very significant newspaper. And then, as Selena was saying, as we got further into it, we couldn't find anything really. It was hard to find information about the editors. There were various editors at different times, and other significant figures that were involved with it, and the publishing organization, the NFCF. They're just, you have to really dig deep to find this information. So we're really happy we were able to bring a lot of it together, and then maybe that will help researchers to kind of expand from where we are at this point.
It's so wonderful that these unique collections, this is where the social currency is. I mean, we could curate collections that we share among other institutions, but it is the local unique collections that's where I think the currency is. And I think students and researchers are focusing their learning and research efforts. So little by little, it's like a continuum, as we mentioned.
Yeah, I had a quick follow-up question for Selena and Deborah. In terms of where did you upload the digital materials? And on those sites, can you see where people are coming from? So can you see if people are coming from, Wikipedia or LibGuide or Google in terms of viewing the collection?
So the collection itself is hosted. It was initially hosted on the Internet Archive because our portal was under a lot of reorganization. And it's still there, and it's also on Cornell's own digital portal, all freely accessible to anyone. And the LibGuide is also hosted at Cornell, but available. It's not behind a paywall or anything. And Wikipedia is on Wikipedia page. But in terms of tracking where people are coming from to view the collection, we only have what the Internet Archive gives us. We have some stats in our portal. We can't tell if they came from the LibGuide or the Wikipedia page that I know of. Maybe that's something we should investigate for the future, but unfortunately, we just don't have a lot of tracking of our digital assets at the moment.
Okay,
Yeah, I asked because I manage oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I manage a digital commons repository, so we can kind of see where the referrals are from. So we tend to get things from Google a lot. So I was just curious if you could see if the Wikipedia or the LibGuide was driving people to the site.
I'm going to find out if we can, but at the moment, I am not aware of being able to do that. But I think it's a great thing for us to explore. So thanks for bringing up that question.
Okay, I do not see any other questions or comments from the chat. So Ashley, I'll let you wrap up the session.
Yeah, so we would like to thank the presenters for giving wonderful presentations and sharing their knowledge and experiences, as well as the audience for their participation. The recording, slides, and chat transcript will be available after this session. And we do have recordings of our previous lightning talks that are available on the ACRL YouTube channel. So if you haven't already attended one or seen them, please check those out. And we'd like to thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.